instrument. I look old. I'm recording already. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, so let's see. We're almost done, you guys. I know. I'm on tenterhooks. I'm not, because I know what's gonna happen, but actually that's not true. Every single time I read this, I'm always on tenterhooks. So all right. This is what goes down. At all events, it was an impressive scene. The long street of gods stretching off toward a colorful torch-lit doll's world of distance in either direction. Low clouds racing overhead, faint ribbons of mist gliding in from the great salt marsh, the rumble of far-distant thunder. Bleat and growl of priests of gods other than Isaac, squealing laughter of women and children. Leather-lunged calling of hawkers and news slaves. Odor of incense curling from temples, mingling with the oily aroma of fried foods on hawkers' trays. The reek of smoking torches, and the musk and flower smells of the gaudy ladies. Isaac's audience, augmented by the many drawn by the tale of last night's doings of the demon acolyte and the wild predictions of Wadras, blocked the street from curb to curb, leaving only difficult gangway through the roofed porticos on either side. All levels of Lankhmarian society were represented, rags and ermine, bare feet and jeweled sandals, mercenaries' steel and philosophers' wands, faces painted with rare cosmetics and faces powdered only with dust. Eyes of hunger, eyes of satiety, eyes of mad belief, and eyes of a skepticism that hid fear. Wadras, panting a little after the long litany, stood on the curb across the street from the low archway of the house where the drunken Fafford slept bound. His shaking hand rested on the cask that, draped now with the garlic bag, was both Isaac's coffer and altar. Crowded so close as to leave him almost no striding space were the inner circles of the congregation, devotees sitting cross-legged, crouched on knees, or squatting on hams. The Mouser had stationed Wiggin and Quatch by an overset fishmonger's cart in the center of the street. They passed back and forth the stone bottle Quatch had snared, doubtless in part to make their odorous post more bearable. Though every time the Mouser noted their bibbing, he had a return to the feeling of occult wrongness. Paul had picked for his post a side of the low archway in front of Fafford's house, to call it that. He kept Grilly beside him, while Mouser crouched nearby after his preparations were complete. Pulg's jeweled mask was hardly exceptional in the setting. Several women were visited, and a few of the other men, colorful blank spots in the sea of faces. It was certainly not a calm sea. Not a few of the audience seemed greatly annoyed at the absence of the giant acolyte and had been responsible for the boos and catcalls during the litany. While even the regulars missed the acolyte's lute and his sweet tenor tale-telling and were exchanging anxious questions and speculations, all it took was someone to shout, "Where's the acolyte?" In a few minutes, half the audience was chanting, "We want the acolyte! We want the acolyte!" Wadras silenced them by looking earnestly up the street with shaded eyes, pretending he saw one coming, and then suddenly pointing dramatically in that direction as if to signal the approach of the man from whom they were calling. While the crowd craned their necks and shoved about, trying to see what Wadras was pretending to, incidentally left off chanting, the ancient priest launched into his sermon. "I will tell you what has happened to my acolyte," he cried. "Lankhmar has swallowed him. Lankhmar has gobbled him up. Lankhmar, the evil city, the city of drunkenness and lechery and all corruption. Lankhmar, the city of the stinking black bones." This last blasphemous reference to the gods of Lankhmar, whom it can be death to mention, though the gods in Lankhmar may be insulted without limit, further shocked the crowd into silence. Wadras raised his hands and faced the low racing clouds. "Oh, Isaac, compassionate mighty Isaac, pity thy humble servitor who now stands friendless and alone. I had one acolyte, strong in thy defense, but they took him from me. You told him, Isaac, much of your life and your secrets. He had ears to hear it, and lips to sing it, but now the black devils have got him. Oh, Isaac, have pity. Bodris spread his hands toward the mob and looked them around. Isaac was a young god when he walked the earth, a young god speaking only of love, yet they bound him to the rack of torture. He brought waters of peace for all in his holy jug, but they broke it. And here Bodris described at great length and with far more vividness than his usual wont, perhaps he had felt he had to make up for the absence of his skald-turned acolyte, the life and especially the torments and death of Isaac of the Jug, until there was hardly one among the listeners who did not have vividly in mind the vision of Isaac on his succession of racks, and who did not feel at least sympathetic twinges in his joints at the thought of the god's suffering. Women and strong men wept unashamedly. Beggars and scullions howled. Philosophers covered their ears. Bodris wailed on toward a shuddering climax. As you yielded up your precious ghost on the 8th rack, O Isaac, as your broken hands fashioned even your torturer's collar into a jug of surpassing beauty, you thought only of us, O holy youth. You thought only of making beautiful the lives of the most tormented and deformed of us, thy miserable slaves. At those words, Pulg took several staggering steps forward from the side of the archway, dragging Grilly with him, and dropped to his knees on the filthy cobbles. His black and silver striped cowl fell back on his shoulders, and his jeweled black vizard slipped from his face, which was thus revealed as unashamedly coursing with tears. I renounce all other gods, the boss extortioner gasped between sobs. Hereafter I serve only gentle Isaac of the Jug. The weaselly Grilly, crouching contortedly in his efforts to avoid being smirched by the nasty pavement, gazed at his master as to one demented, yet could not or still dared not break Pulg's hold on his wrist. Pulg's action attracted no particular attention. Conversions were as Smirdic a score at the moment, but the Mouser took note of it, especially since Pulg's advance had brought him so close that the Mouser could have reached out and patted Pulg's bald pate. The small man in gray felt a certain satisfaction, or rather relief. If Pulg had for some time been a secret Isaac worshipper, well, his faintness might then be explained. At the same time, a gust of emotion akin to pity went through him. Looking down at his left hand, the Mouser discovered that he had taken out of his secret pocket the gold bauble he had filched from Fafford. He was tempted to put it softly in Pulg's palm. How fitting, how soul-shaking, how nice it would be, he thought, if at the moment of the floodgates of religious emotion bursting in him, Pulg were to receive his truly beautiful memento of the god of his choice. But gold is gold, and a black sloop requires as much upkeep as any other color yacht, so the Mouser resisted the temptation. Bodris threw wide his hands and continued, With dry throats, O Isaac, we thirst for thy waters. With gullets burning and cracked, thy slaves beg for a single sip from thy jug. We would ransom our souls for one drop of it to cool us in this evil city damned by black bones. O Isaac, descend to us. Bring us thy waters of peace. We need you, we want you, O Isaac. Come! Such was the power and yearning in that last appeal that the whole crowd of kneeling worshippers gradually took it up, chanting with all reverence, louder and louder, an unendingly repeated, self-hypnotizing response. We want Isaac! We want Isaac! It was that mighty rhythmic shouting which finally penetrated to the small conscious core of Fafford's wine-deadened brain, where he lay drunk in the dark. Though Bodris' remarks about dry throats and burning gullets and healing drops and sips may have opened the way. At any rate, Fafford came suddenly and shudderingly awake, with the one thought in his mind, another drink, and the one sure memory that there was some wine left. It disturbed him a little that his hand was not still on the stone bottle under the edge of the bed, but for some dubious reason up by his ear. He reached for the bottle and was outraged to find that he could not move his arm. Something or someone was holding it. Wasting no time on petty measures, the large barbarian rolled his whole body over mightily with the idea of at once wrenching free from whatever was holding him and getting under the bed where the wine was. He succeeded in tipping the bed on its side, and himself with it, but that didn't bother him. It didn't shake up his numb body at all. What did bother him was he couldn't sense any wine nearby. Smell it, see it squintily, bump his head into it. Certainly not the quart or more he remembered having safeguarded for such an emergency as this. At about the same time, he became dimly aware that he was somehow attached to whatever he'd been sleeping on, especially his wrists and shoulders and chest. However, his legs seemed reasonably free, though somewhat hampered at the knees, and since the bed happened to have fallen partly on the low table, and with its head braced against the wall, the blind twist and heave he gave now actually brought him to his feet, and the bed with him. He squinted around. The curtained outer doorway was an oblong of lesser darkness. He immediately headed for it. The bed foiled his first efforts to get through, bringing him up short in a most exasperating manner. But by ducking and by turning edgewise, he finally managed it, pushing the curtain ahead of him with its face. He wondered muddily if he were paralyzed, the wine he'd drunk all gone into his arms, or if some warlock had put a spell on him. It was certainly degrading to have to go about with one's wrist up about one's ears. And also his head and cheeks and chin felt unaccountably chilly. Possibly another evidence of black magic. The curtain dragged off his head, finally. He saw ahead of him a rather low archway and, vaguely and without being at all impressed by them, crowds of people kneeling and swaying. Ducking down again, he lumbered through the archway and straightened up. Torchlight almost blinded him. He stopped and stood there blinking. After a bit, his vision cleared a little, and the first person he saw that meant anything to him was the Grey Mouser. He remembered now that the last person he had been drinking with was the Mouser. By the same token, in this matter, Fafhr's maggoty mind worked very fast indeed. The Mouser must be the person who had made away with his quart or more of midnight medicine. A great righteous anger flamed in him, and he took a very deep breath. So much for Fafhr from what he saw. What the crowd saw, the god-intoxicated, chanting, weeping crowd, was very different indeed. They saw a man of divine stature strapped with hands high to a framework of some sort. A mightily muscled man, naked save for a loincloth, with a shorn head and face that, marble white, looked startlingly youthful, yet with the expression on his marble face of one who is being tortured. And if anything else were needed, truly it hardly was, to convince them that here was the god, the divine insect they had summoned with their passionately insistent cries, and it was supplied when that nearly 7-foot-tall apparition called out in a deep voice of thunder, "Where is the jug? Where is the jug?" The few people in the crowd who were still standing dropped instantly to their knees at that point or prostrated themselves. Those kneeling in the opposite direction switched round like startled crabs. 200 persons, including Boadres, fainted. And of these, the hearts of 5 stopped beating forever. At least a dozen individuals went permanently mad, though at the moment they seemed no different from the rest, including, among the 12, 7 philosophers and a niece of Lankhmar's high overlord. As one, the members of the mob abased themselves in terror and ecstasy, groveling, writhing, beating breasts or temples, clapping hands to eyes, and peering fearfully through hardly parted fingers as if at an unbearably bright light. It may be objected that at least a few of the mob should have recognized the figure before them as that of Boadres' giant acolyte. After all, the height was right, but consider the differences. The acolyte was full-bearded and shaggy-maned. The apparition was beardless and bald, and strangely so, lacking even eyebrows. The acolyte had always gone robed. The apparition was nearly naked. The acolyte had always used a sweetly high voice. The apparition roared harshly in a voice almost 2 octaves lower. Finally, the apparition was bound to a torture rack, surely, and calling in the voice of one being tortured for his jug. As one, the members of the mob abased themselves. With the exception of Grey Mouser, Grilly, Wiggin, and Quatch, they knew well enough who faced them. Pulg knew too, of course, but he, most subtle-brained in some ways, and now firmly converted to Issackianity, merely assumed that Issac had chosen to manifest himself in the body of Fafford, and that he, Pulg, had been divinely guided to prepare that body for the purpose. He humbly swelled with the full realization of the importance of his own position in the scheme of Issac's reincarnation. His 3 henchmen, however, were quite untouched by religious emotions. Grilly, for the moment, could do nothing as Pulg was still holding his wrist in a grip of fervid strength. But Wiggin and Quatch were free. Although somewhat dull-brained, a little used to acting on their own initiative, they were not long in realizing that the giant had appeared who was supposed to be kept out of the way so that he would not queer the game of their strangely behaving master and his tricky, grey-clad lieutenant. Moreover, they well knew what Jug Fafford was shouting for so angrily, and since they also knew they had stolen and drunken and empty, they likely also were moved by guilty fears, but that Fafford might soon see them, break loose, and visit vengeance upon them. They cranked up their crossbows with furious haste, slapped in quarrels, knelt, aimed, and discharged the bolts straight at Fafford's naked chest. Several persons in the mob noted their action and shrieked at its wickedness. The 2 bolts struck Fafford's chest, bounced off, and dropped to the cobbles. Quite naturally enough, as they were 2 of the fowling quarrels, headed merely with little knobs of wood and used for knocking down small birds, with which the Mouser had topped off their quivers. The crowd gasped in Issac's invulnerability and cried for joy and amazement. However, although fowling quarrels will hardly break a man's skin, even when discharged at close range, they nevertheless sting mightily, even the rather numb body of a man who has recently drunk numerous quarts of wine. Fafford roared in agony, punched out his arms convulsively, and broke the framework to which he was attached. The crowd cheered hysterically at this further proper action in the drama of Issac, which his acolyte had so often chanted. Conclusion next time.